what's the least you can possibly do
Mm.
to do whatever it is? Effectively have fun. Let's say, what's the least you can possibly, we're sitting down where the goal is we're going to do this role-playing game. Everybody's coming over for 3 or 4 hours. I mean, you're the dungeon master, but you got, life to live as well. And it's very easy to always think about what's the most I could possibly do. I mean, in every venture that you're doing, whether it's film or YouTube videos or dungeon, it's dungeon mastering. It's very easy to think, when you're just letting your mind go, what's the most I could possibly do in an ideal world? What would I do? Perfectly painted miniatures and Dwarven Forge level, setups for every encounter. It's very easy to go there in your mind. But a better question, I think, is what's the least you could possibly do to accomplish your objective? And let's say your objective is to have an absolutely fantastic time with your friends at the gaming table that night. So what is the least, like, what should you be doing as a game master? If you're the game master, what's the least you should be doing to have an absolutely blast at the table?
Well, I think like the answer can be zero prep at all. We were talking about like games designed for that. We certainly help with that zero prep methodology when they give you some of the tools you need to help you improvise the session at the table. And that kind of is the key in terms of what I think about in terms of prep, which is, I think if you're doing prep ahead of a session, you need to focus that prep on things that you cannot improvise equally well at the table. And that is not a one-size-fits-all answer. As someone who has been GMing for 40 years, there's stuff I feel comfortable improvising at the table that a first-time GM is probably not going to feel as comfortable doing. So, for example, there have been pickup sessions I've run of D&D where we've sat down like, oh, I don't have a dungeon. I'm going to take 10 seconds and just quickly sketch out a node map, or even just kind of improvise it as we go through it. And I can do that and have it be pretty effective because I have literally years and years and years of experience running dungeons and learning how to run those scenarios. But if I was a first-time GM, that would probably not be a great way of running a session because I'm not comfortable improvising all that stuff. That can also be a personal thing. So, for example, like me personally, I am terrible at improvising names on the fly. And so one of the things I will take the time to prep is a name list for an RPG that I'm running, whether it's a fantasy game or a sci-fi game or even a modern day game. I'll have a list of names behind the screen that I can refer to if I need to improvise an NPC, for example. But there are other people who have no difficulty improvising names off the top of their head, so that wouldn't be good prep for them. That wouldn't be something that would be a value add at the table. And to kind of go back to Drudenfuss's question earlier about those zero prep games, one of the ways in which zero prep games help the GM do that is by giving them procedural generation tools like random encounter tables, for example, or in the case of Blades in the Dark, for example, Blades in the Dark provides pre-built factions, and you can basically just take a handful of factions and take the tools that John Harper, the designer of the game, gives you, and you can quickly throw together a heist-based scenario using the structures discussed in that game. So these are all tools that will help you improvise, and so those are kind of good things to work with. So there's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but the answer can be as little as nothing and just having confidence in your own skills as an improviser or the like. This is actually something that the book is kind of focused on, because what I've experienced as a game master is that when I understand the structure of how a particular type of adventure works, it's a lot easier for me to improvise with confidence within that structure. So, for example, in the mystery section of the book, I talk about the 3-clue rule, which is a core concept of how to design robust mystery scenarios, which is that for any conclusion you want the players to make, you should include at least 3 clues. Well, if you understand that rule, then you know that when you're designing a scene, for example, and you know that the scene needs to lead the players to another scene, you know it has to have 3 clues. It becomes a lot easier to improvise that scene when you sort of consciously understand what needs to be in this scene. 3 clues need to be in this scene. That's one example. We also take that one step further in the book. So there's these scenario structures, like broadly, like how you run a dungeon or how you run a mystery. But there's also specific adventure recipes in the book. So, for example, for mysteries, there's a recipe that I call the 5-node mystery. And the way that works is basically I say, hey, opening scene, 3 other scenes, and a conclusion. And then you hook them up in a very specific way that's described in the recipe. And what's great about the recipe is structurally, I know that structure will work. And so what I have is like 5 sort of containers, if you will, 5 scenes that I know if I link them together in this recipe will work. But what I can do is I can pour sort of any creative ingredients into that structure And that gives me a tool that's, once you know that recipe, can be very powerful for being able to improvise with minimal or no prep at the table, because you know what the structure of play is in this recipe, and you just have to provide the creative content that fills those containers.
Does that it seems like the idea of what to prep would also tie in with that idea of different toys, that you might want to prep your toys. A particular, okay, there's gonna be this particular magic scepter that has this particular power that's resting here, and there's this particular goblin prince that has this particular personality who's here, and to kind of prep those toys and then inject them into the game, but not necessarily, you don't have to prep like what they're going to do, or in a linear way, or like you prep the toys maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Two great games for this, and I mentioned them a couple of times now. Blades in the Dark and Tech Noir both basically do this, where the books are just chock full of the raw toys. And then in both cases, there is a structure that within the games can be used to bring those toys into play in a procedural way. In the case of Blades in the Dark, it's the heist structure. In the case of Tech Noir, it's the plot map that generates the conspiracy that the players are involved in or investigating. But yeah, so again, that's a great example of how you can get to these zero prep games where you have these toys that are baked in and ready to go. Or once you know what you need to prep, you can have those toys on hand. And eventually you may get to a point where you don't necessarily need to prep those toys. You'll know how to improvise those toys and how to use them at the table.
Charlie has a great question here. It says, question, when prepping a session, if you have a block or get stuck, what do you use to spark the creative juices?
That's a great question, Charlie. To some extent, this depends on how much time I have to get sparked. Like if it's the day of the game, I need to get sparked pretty quick. If I've got a few days, the best thing I found is to walk away and read another book, watch a movie. Particularly valuable can be making sure you do that outside of whatever genre you're running a game in. So if I'm running a fantasy game, for example, I can get inspired reading like Stephen Brustfeld, Vlad Tolstoy series, or George R. R. Martin, for example. But I may actually get more inspired reading a nonfiction book about the Middle Ages, or even a nonfiction book about, I don't know, like exploring Saturn, for example. That might inspire me in unusual ways. I like bringing in information from unusual vectors. That's what I find really sparks creativity. The other thing you can do, though, is if you're on a short release, comes back to these procedural generators that used to be more ubiquitous in games, but have kind of fallen away a bit. But for example, like if I need an adventure, for example. One example I give in the book about how to come up with adventures is, okay, well, one way you can think about adventure, there are several, but one way you can think about them is, what is the goal? What are the players seeking in this adventure? And you can, for example, in D&D has a whole section of magic items. Well, magic items are cool. People want them, and you can do things with them. So you can just randomly pick a magic item, and then you can ask yourself, okay, well, who would have this magic item? What are they currently doing with it? And that is a way to begin sparking that adventure and moving it forwards.